Have you ever had to play peacekeeper in your household?
My parents once signed a whole house over to my brother as if they were handing him a birthday card, smiling proudly as though this sudden gesture of generosity was the ultimate symbol of fairness and love. Meanwhile, I sat at the same dinner table with my cheap glass of wine, wondering if anyone would ever remember that I had spent years working double shifts to keep myself afloat, that I had paid every cent of my own rent, and that the most I had ever been gifted was a leftover casserole wrapped in foil. The night they made the announcement still burns in my mind, not because of the house itself, though it was a nice two-story place in the suburbs with a porch my mother gushed about, but because of the look on my father's face when he called it, setting Ryan up for his future. Ryan, of course, didn't even pretend to act surprised. He grinned like a man who had already seen the paperwork and had been rehearsing his acceptance speech for weeks. My mom dabbed her eyes and said, "We just wanted to make sure at least one of our children has stability," as if my years of clawing my way through life didn't count as stability because it hadn't been wrapped in a deed. I bit down on my tongue so hard I could taste the metallic edge of my own restraint. I wanted to ask what had disqualified me from being worthy of a future. Was it that I had gone to school without asking them for tuition money? Was it that I had made choices without consulting the family council? Or was it simply that I wasn't Ryan, the golden boy who could fail his way into applause? The rest of that dinner played out like a show where I was the unwilling audience. Ryan raised his glass and said something about how grateful he was, though I noticed he barely made eye contact with me. He didn't need to. He already knew how it would land. Me, the responsible sister, silently clenching my jaw while he was crowned prince of the family estate. My dad went on about how property is the best investment a person can have, about how Ryan could build equity and maybe even raise a family there one day. He used the phrase head start, which would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting, because Ryan was not at a starting line. He was in the stands, eating nachos, while the rest of us ran laps in the heat. I left that dinner smiling on the outside and boiling on the inside. When my mom hugged me goodbye and whispered, "One day you'll understand why we did this," I nearly told her I understood perfectly. They trusted Ryan more with bricks and drywall than they trusted me with the truth. On the drive home, the glow of the dashboard lights felt like interrogation lamps, forcing me to stare straight into the reality I had been avoiding. I had always known there was favoritism in my family, but this was not favoritism anymore. It was a full-blown declaration that my sacrifices were expected, while my brother's comfort was ensured. For weeks after, every conversation with my parents was salted with comments about how well Ryan was settling into the house, or how nice it will be when the property appreciates. My father even suggested I should think of Ryan's house as a family home for all of us, as though I might one day be grateful to crash in his spare room if life ever became too hard. I nodded politely while my stomach twisted. I had no intention of stepping foot in that house except maybe to drop off a sarcastic welcome mat that said, "Congratulations, your sister pays her own bills." Yet underneath my sarcasm, there was a weight pressing harder each day. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the pattern I could now see clearly. Ryan would always be rescued, rewarded, and excused, while I would always be applauded only for surviving without help. The imbalance was so sharp it cut through every memory, even the ones I had tried to paint over. Suddenly, my entire childhood replayed with a new filter. The birthday gifts, the just for Ryan vacations, the way my dad called me independent, like it was a compliment, when really it had been permission to forget me. The thought that haunted me most wasn't envy, it was dread. Because when someone is gifted a house without earning it, it doesn't end there. It sets a stage. A stage where mistakes are softened by family cushions, where recklessness is forgiven in advance. And sitting at my tiny kitchen table, paying bills by the light of a discount lamp, I realized that one day those cushions might be stitched together from my own resources, from my own hard work, and from my own name. I should have called it out then. I should have said something sharp and final, drawn a line. But I didn't. I swallowed my pride, told myself to focus on my own path, and let the bitterness simmer quietly. I told myself that Ryan's gift was not my problem. But even as I repeated that mantra, I knew I was lying. Because deep down, I could already sense that this so-called gift was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a debt, and I wasn't the one holding the house keys. And sure enough, the first crack appeared late one night, months later, when my phone lit up with Ryan's name and the kind of panicked voicemail that confirmed everything I had feared. He wasn't calling to brag this time. He was calling because his perfect little house was about to become the heaviest weight of his life, and somehow, he was already planning to hand it to me. When Ryan's voicemail arrived in the kind of shaky midnight tone that makes the room feel colder than it is, I lay there listening to his words slosh around like bad coffee in a travel mug, all jitter and no substance. And while he tried to sound calm as he explained that a few charges had snowballed and that the contractor misquoted the kitchen remodel and that there had been unexpected costs with the roof because apparently shingles are now diamonds, I could hear the deeper thing. Underneath the script, he was terrified and he wanted to plug that feeling with my name the way you jam a rag into a leaking pipe and pretend it's a repair. The message ended with a long inhale and a soft, "Call me first thing," and I stared at the ceiling for a minute, thinking about how many times in my life I had gotten up early for someone else's comfort, for someone else's version of what a good daughter or a good sister is, and how tidy it would be to roll over now, sleep it off, and wake up. Pretending the house he was drowning in had never been handed to him like a floaty at a pool party. Morning broke with the cheap alarm on my phone and the ordinary rituals that make a person feel sane: coffee grounds smacking the filter, the kettle rumbling like a small train, the cat judging me from the back of a chair. And I let those little noises push me into a better mood before I called him, because I did not want to go in hot and give him the pleasure of painting me as dramatic while he wore his favorite costume, the poor misunderstood man who tried. He picked up on the first ring, his voice already sprinting, and poured out the version he wanted me to buy. The credit cards were just a bridge, the cash-out refinance was tiny and temporary, the property taxes were late because the county changed something. The Airbnb guests had canceled during the slow months, and the kitchen island went over budget because he didn't realize waterfall quartz costs more than laminate, which in his telling sounded like the universe had conspired against him with glossy stone and municipal calendars. I let him run until he tired himself out, then asked the question that never shows up on family greeting cards, which is whether he had actually totaled the debt, not vibes, not guesses, not the ballpark that people use when they are trying to sell you a problem as if it were a used car, but the hard number, the one that makes the room stop. He mumbled through a few amounts, coughing up store names like they were allergies, electronics, furniture, a boutique mattress company with a name that sounded like an expensive yoga pose, and when I began stacking them in a notebook, his confidence wobbled the way a bad table does when the waiter keeps forgetting to shove another sugar packet under the short leg. By the time he admitted there was also a line of credit tied to the house, because a lender spoke to him like a pal and said equity is wasted if it just sits there, I had finished my coffee and my sympathy. And I could feel the old story of our family thudding against my ribs again. Ryan gets a parachute, I get a lecture on self-reliance, and somehow I'm still expected to fold the parachute after he drags it through the mud. What threw me wasn't the number, though it belonged in the kind of cartoon where the eyes pop out and the jaw drops. It was how casually he said our parents had suggested I cosign a consolidation loan, as if the natural consequence of someone else's spending spree is the liquidation of my good credit and the permanent residency of his problems on my paperwork. And I realized he had already rehearsed the pitch and the part where I would be magnanimous, because that is what I have always been. Coach to be, the reliable sister who doesn't make a fuss and keeps the house of cards from collapsing by holding her breath. I told him I would look into it, which is code in my body for I will investigate the angles you hope I won't see, and I hung up with a voice so even it could have passed a sobriety test. I went to work, not the office kind, but the unpaid labor that women know by heart, the spreadsheet of facts that get ignored when families prefer a myth, the quiet calls to a friend in lending who has seen every version of a smiling catastrophe. The slow gathering of documents that people claim they cannot find until you say the word audit, and as the day wore on and my patience became a taut wire, I opened the family group chat that my mother uses for casserole photos and holiday scheduling and Typed a simple sentence that tasted like clean metal, looping everyone in so we're aligned on Ryan's ask, and then, with the same deliberate calm I reserve for cutting a straight line through wrapping paper, I attached the audio file of his trembling voicemail, added a neat bullet list of the debt categories in my notebook, and closed with a cheerful suggestion that we discuss the plan openly tonight so there are no misunderstandings. The message landed like a steel tray dropped in a quiet kitchen, followed by the predictable pings of defensive hearts and brittle thumbs up and my father's very formal, "Let's discuss this offline," which, translated, means, "We do not like the lights on when we are moving furniture," and Ryan texted me privately with a soggy mixture of wounded pride and accusation, insisting I had embarrassed him when he is just trying to fix things. But I answered with a polite ribbon of words about transparency and family teamwork and how the house had been presented to me as a shared future, which meant shared clarity, and then I put my phone face down and let the silence do the part of the work I can never do alone. By dinner time, the group chat had quieted to a guilt haze, which in my family is what passes for prayer, and I felt the first small click of satisfaction that comes when you refuse to be the secret trash bin for other people's messes. Because while no money had changed hands and no signatures had stained paper, the balance had shifted a notch toward daylight. The myth had been nicked, the performance cracked, and my brother's emergency had been moved from my private shoulder to the center of the family table, where it belonged, and as I rinsed my coffee cup and watched the last drip slide down the sink, my phone vibrated with a calendar invite from my mother for a quick meeting at the bank tomorrow, which told me they still imagined a finale where I provided the pen, even as I was already considering a different ending entirely, the kind where the signature that ruined everything never touches the page at all. The calendar invite arrived like a neat little grenade dressed in politeness, and while my mother's subject line promised a quick meeting that would get us all on the same page, the subtext was a lot less delicate. Because I knew the page she had in mind was the one where my name appeared in crisp letters under the word cosigner, so I spent the evening turning the problem around like a stubborn jar lid and, instead of rehearsing the speech they expected, the one where I'd pledge loyalty, swallow misgivings, and sign with a smile, I began building a quiet scaffolding of facts that would make the page itself unusable, since there is no sweeter revenge than preventing a bad story from ever making it to print. I started by calling a friend who works in lending compliance, a woman who can smell nonsense through drywall and whose favorite hobby is quoting regulations like poetry, and I asked her, hypothetically of course, what an underwriter would do if a borrower had undisclosed liabilities tied to a property that had been presented to family as mortgage-free, and she laughed a soft professional laugh and said the words that clicked like a seatbelt in my chest, material misrepresentation, which is a phrase that means a loan goes from possible to radioactive without ever leaving the dock. While the cat watched with supervisory disdain, I pulled county property records, because public data is the one thing this country never hides from a woman with a Wi-Fi connection and a grudge, and there it was in monochrome. The home equity line that Ryan had dressed up as temporary, sitting like a rusted anchor on the title, plus a recorded notice for delinquent taxes that made my stomach drop even though I had predicted it, and I printed the pages on my old, cranky printer that chews paper the way a toddler chews toast, and slid them into a plain folder the color of damp cardboard, which felt satisfyingly unsexy for such potent content. I added my notebook totals for the boutique mattress and the waterfall quartz and the aspirational appliances that talk to your phone as if you need your dishwasher to send affirmations. And with every line the picture sharpened into something less like a family favor and more like a disguised extraction, because at the end of all the pleading and guilt there was a single truth waiting patiently. If I co-signed, I would be borrowing trouble with interest, and the bank would happily notarize the transfer. Before I went to sleep, I performed a small, delicious act that tasted like rinsed glass, which was to place a freeze on my credit across all 3 bureaus, and although that might sound like a purely defensive move, in our family it counted as a slap wrapped in silk, because it removed their favorite emergency exit, the one where documents get started and we'll fix the details later, leaving them to confront the empty stage without my mark ready, and then, because I have learned that Paperwork can be more powerful than anger if you use it with patience. I filed an identity theft prevention alert as well, not because I believed anyone would forge my signature, though I did not entirely rule out creative reinterpretations of consent, but because the resulting callbacks would send any overeager loan officer into compliance mode and convert sales enthusiasm into meticulous caution, which is the one language this situation needed. I slept light and woke early, and as the kettle hummed, and the cat revised his opinion of me based on the opening can, I drafted a one-page letter of financial boundaries, written in calm, lawyerly sentences that explained how my credit, my income, and my future housing options were not community property, and that any arrangement would require a full forensic of debts, a written repayment schedule backed by collateral not owned by me, and monthly escrow monitoring, which is to say I built a maze with no cheese and dared them to call it love. We met at the bank in the late afternoon under that institutional lighting that makes everyone look slightly insincere, and Ryan arrived in a button-down he reserves for apologies, while my parents wore the tight smiles of people who hope the camera is not recording sound, and the loan officer, a man with a hair part sharp enough to slice paper, ushered us into a glass cube and began the performance with a warm spiel about consolidating obligations into a manageable instrument, which is a phrase that sounds like a lullaby until you read the footnotes, and he slid the preliminary terms across the table with the confidence of someone who expects people to sign because the font is friendly. I let the pages sit, breathed once, and then, with a tone so civil it could have passed for gratitude, I asked whether the underwriting file reflected the recorded home equity line, the past due property tax notice, and the revolving balances from the boutique store accounts, and when his smile flickered like a dying dashboard light, I opened my folder and placed the printouts on the table the way a magician reveals there is no rabbit, only an empty hat and a receipt. My parents shifted in their chairs, Ryan cleared his throat as if that could delete a lean, and the loan officer straightened his already straight posture and said he would need to look into a few items before proceeding, which in bank language is a siren with perfect pitch, and while everyone scrambled for tone and explanation, I folded my boundary letter once, set it on top of the pile like a tidy gravestone, and delivered the only revenge that mattered today, which was not fury or spectacle, but a firm refusal dressed as documentation, a slow door closing that made the room suddenly smaller, and as the officer excused himself to consult compliance, and my mother whispered that I had blindsided the family, I kept my voice low and even and said I would never cosign a lie, not even a family-sized one, and then I stood up with the kind of calm that makes people nervous, because revenge sometimes looks exactly like leaving while the mess stays seated. And as I reached the lobby, my phone vibrated with a new message that made the floor tilt. The underwriter wanted to speak with me privately, and the subject line said discrepancies, which meant the next move would not happen at the table where they controlled the script, but in a room where the lights were brighter and the questions wore badges. When the underwriter called me into a separate office the following week, the air in the room carried the faint chemical tang of fresh toner and nervous sweat, the kind of environment where truth tends to arrive stripped of excuses. And as I sat down opposite her desk, I felt an odd mixture of vindication and dread, because while part of me wanted Ryan's disaster to finally be documented in language colder than family guilt, another part of me knew that once those words hit paper, the fallout would no longer be limited to dinner table lectures or sibling squabbles. It would become a matter of record, unspinnable and impossible to bury under the quilt of our family's "we did our best" mythology. She explained with the measured tone of someone trained to deliver bad news gently that the inconsistencies in Ryan's application were not minor omissions, but significant misrepresentations, which meant the loan package was not simply delayed, but effectively torpedoed, and though she never used the word fraud, the silence she left between phrases gave it shape. I nodded, pretending to absorb this, as if it were new information, while in truth my folder at home already contained enough printouts to anticipate every bullet point she ticked off. That night I went to bed early, but my thoughts dragged me into the old attic of family history, replaying scenes where Ryan's stumbles had always been transformed into charming anecdotes, while my efforts were narrated as dry obligations. And I realized that what unsettled me most was not the scale of his debt, but the inevitability with which my parents had tried to shift its weight onto me. They believed in their bones that I was the catch basin, the safety net, the adult in the room, and therefore it was natural, even righteous, that I should be the one to hold the family roof up when Ryan set fire to it. The realization carried a strange relief because it freed me from wondering whether they genuinely believed I had been treated equally all these years. They had not, and they never would. And that clarity became the steel rod around which I began twisting the revenge I had been planning quietly since the night of the house gift. I knew confrontation would tempt them to frame me as bitter, so instead I chose subversion, because the most effective revenge is rarely loud but rather designed to let arrogance collapse under its own weight. I scheduled another meeting with the loan officer, making sure Ryan and my parents believed I was finally softening to their arguments, and I brought my folder again, but did not show my cards immediately. I let them begin with their rehearsed speeches about family unity, about how this was not about Ryan alone but about preserving our legacy, and I even allowed myself to look hesitant, scribbling meaningless notes as if I were balancing pros and cons. While inside, I felt the coil of anticipation that comes when you know you are about to append the script so completely that the actors won't know their lines anymore. When the officer turned to me for confirmation, expecting my signature or at least my tentative consent, I opened the folder slowly and asked if the application reflected the secondary lien that had been filed 2 months prior against Ryan's property for unpaid contractor bills, a detail I had uncovered through a late-night search that my brother clearly thought would remain buried. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent tubes overhead, and in that stillness my parents shifted uncomfortably while Ryan's face flushed crimson, his lips moving without sound as though he were trying to inhale words that refused to materialize. The officer, startled but composed, admitted that such a lien had not been disclosed and that this changed the risk profile entirely, and he excused himself to verify records while taking the folder from my hand. My parents turned on me in hushed fury, accusing me of sabotaging the process, of airing dirty laundry in front of outsiders, but I met their whispers with a calmness that frightened even me, because I had no rage left, only precision. And I said that any debt tied to the family name without transparency was not family business, but personal deceit, and I would no longer participate in disguising deceit as loyalty. When we left the bank, the silence between us was dense and bitter, broken only by the metallic clink of the glass door shutting behind us. And I realized with an almost physical jolt that this was the first time I had walked out of such a confrontation without feeling guilty for protecting myself. My father muttered something about betrayal, my mother dabbed at imaginary tears, and Ryan stormed his car without looking back, but I felt lighter, because while the practical problem of his debt remained, the performance of inevitability had been shattered. They could no longer assume I would shoulder it. The cost of his recklessness was now his to carry, and the record of it sat in the bank's files like a permanent witness. That evening, as I poured myself a glass of cheap wine and sat by the window watching the last strips of sunlight peel away from the street, I thought about revenge not as a single act, but as a process of dismantling illusions, brick by brick, until those who built their comfort on your silence have to confront the echo of their own schemes. And while the victory was not yet complete, because families like mine rarely surrender after one failed attempt, I felt the shift in the air, the first taste of a future where I no longer existed as a walking cosign, a human safety net, or a silent partner in other people's delusions. The war was not finished, but the battlefield was finally mine to choose. In the days that followed the collapse of the loan application, the atmosphere in my family's orbit thickened into a fog of accusations, half-spoken pleas, and the kind of awkward silences that feel louder than shouting. And I found myself navigating the odd sensation of being both the villain in their narrative and the only person in the room who had refused to play a fool. Ryan sulked like a boy who had been caught cheating at cards, disappearing into long drives and sending the occasional vague text about how things will work out, as though optimism could be stretched into collateral. while my parents oscillated between icy coldness and sudden bursts of guilt-soaked persuasion, reminding me that families survive by sacrifice and asking if I really wanted to be remembered as the one who turned her back, when everything could have been solved with a single signature. Their words were rehearsed and repetitive, yet behind them I heard the hollow echo of desperation, because for the first time in our lives they understood that my refusal was not a pause in the performance, but the end of their script entirely. What they could not comprehend was that I had already rewritten my role, and that the satisfaction of my revenge came not from humiliating them in a bank office, but from the larger transformation of no longer being chained to the expectations that had always drained me. I began taking small, but deliberate steps to reinforce the boundaries I had declared. I opened new accounts with banks that offered identity monitoring, not because I feared fraud, but because the act itself symbolized independence. I redirected my savings into investments I had researched myself, something I had put off for years while believing that family obligations would forever interrupt my plans. And I even told my closest friends the story without shame, stripping it of the secrecy my parents had depended on, because I wanted the tale to live outside of me, to exist as a shared warning about what happens when you let other people mistake your reliability for consent. Meanwhile, Ryan's problems deepened in predictable spirals. The house that had been framed as his grand foundation began to sag under the weight of unpaid contractors and overdue taxes, and eventually a notice appeared taped to his front door, fluttering like a scarlet flag on an abandoned ship. He called me late one night, his voice hoarse and desperate, asking if there was any way I might still intervene, but his words fell flat because desperation spoken aloud has none of the power of entitlement whispered behind closed doors. I listened, steady and silent, until he realized I would not rescue him, and then I told him calmly that it was never my job to co-sign his mistakes, and that perhaps the truest gift our parents had given him was not the house, but the lesson that a roof without responsibility is just a temporary shelter. He hung up without replying, and I felt neither triumph nor pity, only the steady certainty that I had returned his burdens to the rightful owner. The most striking shift, however, came from within myself. For years I had lived in a posture of waiting, expecting that sooner or later another crisis would land on my lap, that I would once again be called to patch the holes in Ryan's story while my own efforts went unnoticed. But now, with the bank's files stamped and his debts exposed, I realized there was no more hiding behind the illusion of family unity. The truth was public, undeniable, and mine to step away from. I thought back to that dinner table where my parents had once announced Ryan's gift with theatrical pride, and I remembered the taste of iron in my mouth as I bit my tongue. That iron taste returned now, but it was different. It was no longer restraint. It was resolve, the strength of someone who had forged her own shield from the very material that had once kept her silent. I will not pretend the ending was cinematic. My parents did not collapse in tears begging forgiveness, and Ryan did not suddenly mature into a man who thanked me for saving him from himself. Instead, life continued in quieter tones, with strained phone calls about holidays I did not attend and the occasional piece of mail mistakenly forwarded from his address to mine, each envelope a reminder of the debts that were his to own. But within that anticlimax lay the deepest form of revenge, the restoration of my own life, unburdened, unentangled, and unapologetically mine. My parents had given Ryan a house, yes, but in the process they had unwittingly given me something far greater, the clarity to see that my worth was not defined by how much of his collapse I could absorb. Even now, when I walk past houses with their neat porches and glowing windows, I sometimes wonder if my brother still sits in his, surrounded by bills and unopened envelopes, wondering how the safety net slipped away. And then I remind myself that it did not slip away, it was cut, deliberately and finally, by the very person who had been trapped in it for too long. They had given him a structure of wood and drywall, but I had given myself something sturdier, the refusal to be used, the courage to let others face the storms they created, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes revenge is not about destroying someone else's foundation, but about building your own so strong that you never again have to knock on their door for shelter. And so the story ended not with their redemption or collapse, but with my emancipation, a conclusion as ambiguous as it is final, leaving the unanswered question to anyone who hears it: what matters more in the end, the house they gave him, or the freedom I finally claimed for myself?